Did you know there's a good chance that your favorite museums are nonprofits? And someone has to start those nonprofits. In this video, we're going to meet Julia Whitehead, a nonprofit founder who loved Kurt Vonnegut so much that she launched a Kurt Vonnegut museum in her city of Indianapolis to bring the author's message to thousands of people. We'll talk about getting started, how to fundraise for a nonprofit museum, lessons learned along the way. Oh, and by the way, how she got a famous comedian to serve on her board of directors. If you are thinking of starting a nonprofit, maybe even a nonprofit museum, I hope that Julia's story and insights provide some inspiration along the way. Once again, I'm Amber Melanie Smith, nonprofit founder, social entrepreneur, and social impact YouTuber. Don't forget to check out my website, changemakercafe.com, for more resources and tips and strategies and all sorts of things to help you on your journey to make an impact, whether that's through starting a nonprofit, social enterprise, or other type of leadership in your community. All right, let's go meet Julia. Julia, I'm so excited to have you here today. I'd love to have you start out by just sharing who you are, your role, the organization you started and now lead. Tell us all about it.
Thank you. So I'm Julia Whitehead. I'm the founder and CEO of the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library here in Indianapolis. So Kurt Vonnegut was a World War II veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war. His harrowing experience at the hands of the Nazis, being held underground and in a prisoner of war camp in Dresden, Germany, became the basis for his book Slaughterhouse-Five. He wrote many other books, many collections of short stories, and also, wrote essays. He was a visual artist. He dabbled in theater and movie making or at least participation in film, and really all of the arts. He was someone who was considered a national thinker, kind of the conscience for America during the Vietnam War, anti-war movement, and many other aspects of 20th century American life he weighed in on, and people valued what he said.
And so now you have started a museum to honor that. Tell us what the museum does.
We are in this wonderful building in the heart of Indianapolis in the historic African American Cultural District. And so our building is not just a museum for Vonnegut. We are not just a lending library. We are a community gathering space. We do exhibitions on a variety of things that matter to Vonnegut that included human rights and the need for public libraries and environmentalism and a variety of, really important topics that most families care about.
All right. So take us back to the beginning. First of all, how long have you been doing this work?
I came up with the idea for the museum in November 2008. And we were able to officially become a 501c3 in December 2009. And we were given some donated space at the end of 2010. I quit my full-time job to take this on in January 2011. And then the next milestone was in 2019. We raised $1.5 million in 75 days to buy our building. For a small nonprofit like us, that's a tremendous undertaking. And so we own our building outright.
But I'd love to have you go back in your mind to those early days and think about the need, the market research. How did you know that this was something your community needed? And what was your process studying the landscape and doing that market research to identify that this needed to be a nonprofit?
I knew just enough about Kurt Vonnegut, and I knew that he had sold millions of copies of his books over the years when he first started publishing in the later half of the 20th century. So I knew he was a huge deal on the national and international level. what I didn't know is, would my community support something like this? Most people here, even now, most people don't know who Kurt Vonnegut is, but people on the East Coast and West Coast, and certainly university towns and cities all over the world know the relevance of Vonnegut, because he was just such an important thinker. But I didn't know how this would play out, so I just started talking to lots of people in my community. Um, it it was a bit of a miracle that the people I reached out to were people who happened to be Kurt Vonnegut fans. It's just a certain kind of, you can just make some assumptions about people who are fans of protecting the environment and supportive of our public schools and public libraries and things. And, so I got lucky with making some assumptions from the start. But then for the people who really didn't know very much about Vonnegut, when they started to learn more about him, then they wanted to be part of it too. Knowing that we were supporting veterans, that we do youth writing programs, teacher training, all of these things. And supporting Vonnegut, it doesn't mean you're just supporting the work of a particular writer. It means you're supporting these important ideals that relate to American democracy and really all of the very best things about living in America.
I love that. Okay, so talk a little bit about your first program. How did it start, and how has it grown since then?
So our first program was, it was on its way to being a gala, like an annual gala, but it was a combination of things that included a panel discussion, and a keynote. The next year, for that same event, the Night of Vonnegut Gala, we had a goal. Our big goal was to raise $1,200 in the one night. That was such a big goal, which is interesting looking back as to where we are now. But at the time, like, we couldn't get it. I ended up donating $800 of my own funds to get us to the $1,200 goal that night so that we wouldn't fail in meeting, as the thermometer on the screen is like, and we're just like, oh boy, this is what it is to be a founder. You don't want your organization to fail. Like, you're doing anything you can to help it succeed.
Julia, I talk a lot in other videos about the importance of measuring your impact, measuring your success, because of course, as nonprofits, our goal is to create positive community change. And so I always want to know, like, is it working? What is the data telling us? I'm very interested to hear, especially as a museum and an educational organization, what are the ways you know that you're successful? How do you measure that? What are the outputs and outcomes?
Thank you for this question, because I think when you're thinking with a business hat on, you're thinking about all of those measures that relate to the money. Are we able to not just sustain ourselves, but to grow? Are we able to meet our needs with operating a building and paying, for a hefty payroll for our staff and all of the things that you need when you're a museum and lending library and community gathering space? But what I love even more than the measures that relate to numbers is the metrics that relate to, are we meeting the core for why we exist? So are we being diverse? Are we being equitable? Are we being inclusive? Are we accessible to all kinds of people, no matter what their, condition is, or, financial situation or whatever? So we have DEI, but we also have DEI-AB, which the B is for belonging. So are we creating the kind of space where people feel like they belong?
I really love that, because you've labeled the museum as also this community gathering space, right? And so how do you measure if that's successful? Well, people who enter the door feel like they belong. I think that's really important.
Thank you. And you can certain programs, because Vonnegut was so much into lots of things. Like, he loved humor. We have comedians involved. He loved theater. He loved jazz and musical performances. But not everybody likes everything. So when we can see, okay, this is 100 people who are predominantly African Americans, and we're talking about, Black culture, Black, music, or Black writing, censored writers, or, all different topics, we're able to show that we are a venue for lots of different audiences. And then there's our youth writing program, which is in all 4 of the Indianapolis public high schools and is in our building, as well as a youth writing center. So when you see students of all backgrounds coming into our space, working in our space, but then also out in the Kurt Vonnegut writing centers in 4 public high schools, that is incredible to have that kind of reach. And we've been able to do that in the schools just over this past 5 years. So, I mentioned the numbers, admissions and, the budget. Are you meeting the budget? But when you can show that your writing program is touching the lives of 54% of the public high school students in Indianapolis after just a few years of existence, that's incredible. I think this would be a tip for anybody who's creating a nonprofit or trying to grow it, is finding out why other groups fail, finding out what makes them successful, finding out what makes them fail. That failure piece is really super important to understand. And you don't come at it from the perspective of, oh, well, you guys failed at this thing, or, y'all failed at this. It's more, how can we all work together? Because if another group has the same audience as your nonprofit has, I don't look at those folks as competitors. I see them as, kindred spirits, right? Who want to do that important work, whatever it is that is important enough to, be given a 501c3 nonprofit status by the IRS for charitable work. So that, I guess that would be a big lesson early on for me, that someone told me early on, that you don't have to be competitive. You can raise all boats.
Tell me a little bit about training you had, education you had, or gained as you were starting the nonprofit that you think would be helpful to other nonprofit founders.
My bachelor's was English. I had some different certificate programs, including fundraising through the Indiana University School for Philanthropy, which I highly recommend for anybody starting a nonprofit. They also have a program in nonprofit management that's more extensive, but super worthwhile. My master's was international relations. That seems like it's not necessarily related, but it is when you have to learn about conflict resolution. The second thing I mentioned, books. So there's a book called Radical Candor that I read more recently that I wished I had read as a young person, especially as a young woman, to be able to speak more directly about what I think and what I need, and so that's one. But then also there's a book called The Last Word on Power by a lady named Tracy Goss. It's looking at what is holding you back? What are you afraid of? But then also there was just that kind of third category of things, just the job experiences. So when I was at Eli Lilly, I volunteered to be they called it a Lilly ambassador. And basically I was leading tours of the company buildings, including the historic building where Colonel Lilly started the very first pharmacy in Indianapolis. And talking, it's basically a museum, talking people and sharing with them about how those early medicines were created back in the late 1800s when he was getting started with his company. And that's just one example. I mean, all of my jobs had a option of taking on a little bit more that went beyond the job requirements. Um, and I would always volunteer for things that related to the history, or, writing something or giving a tour of something. I love storytelling. Storytelling is so important for anybody who's starting a nonprofit.
Let's talk finances. When you first started out in those first couple of years, what were your top expenses? And then fast forward to today, what are the top expenses now? How does it compare?
Yeah. So in the first few years, salaries were the top expense. We did not have any building expenses because we were given donated space, and utilities, which was amazing. We did have programmatic expenses, but at that time, I would just go around begging people to do things on the cheap. So it was salaries, it was programs, and then, followed by some operating expenses beyond that. And then we had the big year 2019 when we bought our building. And then for a couple of years, our building was our biggest expense, followed by salaries and programs. And then within roughly that year of buying our building, that was the Black Lives Movement. And we really took it seriously to look at all of our everything to be equitable, to be diverse, equitable, inclusive, accessible, and create a sense of belonging. So, we're looking like, okay, who do we hire for our vendors? We're hiring a food truck. Like, everything we did, staffing to program partners, program planning, we wanted to be more diverse, but we knew also that meant that we had to spend more money on programs. And I mean, everything got more expensive for us for a good reason, to make sure that our creative class here in Indianapolis could get paid what they deserve to be paid for things, to feel like they can say yes to a project because, wow, the Vonnegut Library is paying me what I feel like I deserve to be paid, right? And so then it became, and where it is now, so it's programs and exhibitions, followed by staff cost, followed by building. But they're all so similar as far as the cost. It's almost a third, and a third.
So, talk numbers if you can remember. What was your like the dollar amount of your budget in the first couple of years, and what is it now?
So our first year, when we were trying to become an official nonprofit, we were in the $60,000 to $80,000 range, and then I wasn't taking a salary at that point. So I came up with the idea in 2008. We had a small budget in 2009, and the same for 2010. And then in 2011, I believe it was up to 125,000. And now our budget is 1.4 million. Obviously, when we bought the building, it required a major increase in staff members. So yeah, it's really, I mean, it it went from that event I mentioned where we were just trying to raise $1,200 at the gala. And then, now our galas can bring several $100,000 in donations.
In those early years, what was the breakdown of your revenue sources? And then fast forward to today, what does it look like now?
Yeah, so early years grants were really high, and then individual donations, and then next was our earned income. We have a gift shop in the museum. We do admissions, things like, a silent auction, or, that kind of thing. As the organization grew, it was really important for us to grow the individual donor base and to make that the greatest source of our funding. And some years we're able to do that. Some years we go back to having grants be the highest section of the pie chart, the largest section of the pie chart. So those kind of go back and forth.
Curious about, you said in the early years, grants was a major source. And in my experience, it is very rare for a startup nonprofit to have grants as a major source of revenue at all. And I wonder, can you talk a little bit more about, is it because you're a museum? Like what kinds of grants were these, and why do you feel like they were the best revenue fit for you at the time?
Yeah, I cannot speak more highly of our grant funders over these years. It might be that we are something unique here in Indianapolis because of certain grant funders who are based here, who have such a dedication to the humanities, arts and humanities. I think the fact that we do a great deal of programming around veterans and the arts, suicide prevention, our youth programs, our teacher programs. And I think the grant funders see that work and see that, like, wow, they're not just reaching the 75-year-old military veteran, they're getting that 35-year-old veteran who, by the way, also needs the suicide prevention training, right? And that relevance, that meeting a community need, I think is how we've been able to get some funding from, all kinds of different organizations.
Hey, me again. I just wanted to take a moment to thank this video's sponsor, Click and Pledge. Click and Pledge is a comprehensive fundraising platform and solution designed for nonprofits ready to raise some money and grow. Whether you're starting a nonprofit museum, growing an existing organization, or some other mission. Their robust fundraising features include text-to-give campaigns, peer-to-peer fundraising, where you can organize it so your supporters are out there raising money for your cause. Video fundraising with donation links embedded right in the videos so you can track exactly the timestamp where someone donated. Personalized donor thank you videos and messages to increase your donor retention, a complete Salesforce integration, and lots of other integrations and more. Some platforms are going to charge more based on how big your organization's budget or donor base gets, but not Click and Pledge. The monthly fee stays the same no matter how big your donor list gets, meaning you can raise more money without having more costs. There are no contracts, and all of their solutions are included as part of that flat monthly fee. Scan the QR code to get a free month of Click and Pledge, or you can even schedule a demo and learn more at the links below this video. Thanks again to Click and Pledge for sponsoring this video. So all of this comes together and you're able to be the executive director because the board voted to hire you. That's how that works in nonprofits. As we know, you can't hire yourself, unfortunately. The board votes and hires you and determines your salary based on the annual budget. Go back in time a little bit with us and explain, how did you work with your board to be able to be the full-time executive director? Because this is a question I get from a lot of founders, is how does that happen?
Yeah, it happens through advocating for yourself, right? And so we were getting ready to be able to open to the public. And it was that turning point of, do I get to do this job, or are you going to find somebody else to do it? My board was so supportive of me and the work, what I had done to create the organization. And they were happy with my performance and, my vision for programs and events and things like that. And so they made me feel like they wanted me to do that. So what that meant was I had to leave a super well-paying job that had a lot of, potential for growth, and the benefits were amazing. So that was on me to decide, okay, do I want to take this risk? And I knew I absolutely did, because it was my dream, right? My dream job. but I had to advocate for I was encouraged by a friend who's a lawyer to ask for a contract, to get all of this in writing. And I asked for a certain salary that I thought fair with where we were, what we would be able to raise. And, to the credit of my board, they agreed that it was a fair number, and they, signed that contract, and I was able to go on. I have friends who run nonprofits who still don't have a paycheck after many years. And the only bit of advice I have there is like, nobody is going to volunteer to give you money. I do that with our employees who are our volunteers, or, because I don't want to lose them. Right. But most people don't want to give people money for a salary. Like, they don't think about the fact that humans are the very best asset that you have, right? And so it takes a lot. It takes that self advocacy and knowing that you're not asking for something unfair or unreasonable to be paid for the work you're doing.
So it sounds like for first couple of years you worked as a volunteer to get things up and running. How many years was that?
Yeah, so from late 2008 until January 26th of 2011, I was a volunteer.
Okay. And are you willing to share what your first salary was?
If I remember correctly, I think it was between 65,000 and 80,000.
That's respectable. At least you can pay your bills on that.
Yeah.
Now, Julia, I noticed when I was looking at your website that you have kind of a famous board member. Who's that? How did you recruit him?
So the famous comedian Louis Black, nationally touring, worldwide touring comedian. He is our board chair. He's done it for a couple of years now. We have asked him to remain on as board chair. About 10 years ago, I went to one of his comedy performances here in Indianapolis. And after the show, he was signing his book, which I believe was called I'm Dreaming of a Black Christmas or something, which is super funny, But I was in line to have him sign my book, and, he's, getting the book, he's signing the book, with people in front of me. And then I see that he's not particularly chit-chatting with people because he's got a huge line of people, right? But then when I came up to him, I said, "Are you a fan of Kurt Vonnegut?" And I'm just this like young woman, like so enthusiastic about Kurt Vonnegut. And he had his glasses on and he put his pen down. And I think he hadn't looked up at all during the evening when, of book signing. And he looked up and he said, yes, I am a Kurt Vonnegut fan. And I said, "Oh, because we've started a museum and library and it's just down the street. And we would really love to show you the museum. And well, we would really love to have you as an honorary board member." Oh, wow. And I just, that's kind of how I've been during my life. I was just super enthusiastic about it. And he wrote down the name of his assistant and he said, yes, I'd be very interested in knowing more about this museum. Kurt Vonnegut was a major influence on my writing life back from, when I was in college. He talked about reading Vonnegut books while he was doing a part-time job as a parking lot attendant. And so I called his assistant. We arranged for him to come to the museum on his next visit. And he's been with us ever since. I mean, I might have only ever seen him 5 times in these 10 years and not always in Indianapolis. But he is so dedicated, so devoted. Maybe we've only seen each other a handful of times, but we are on the phone, regularly. He attends the board meetings. He leads the board meetings. He is so dedicated to the few nonprofits that he supports, and he's on a couple of other nonprofit boards. He's been a wonderful supporter for us, and and just personally. And I'll just share this part too. During the pandemic, during COVID quarantine, this was before he became board chair. He was alone in his apartment in New York, could not travel, right? Could not go do his tours of his comedy performance. But that period of COVID quarantine, we created a program called Kurt Vonnegut Graduation Party. And we did it for all those students around the country who could not attend a graduation ceremony. And so Lewis Black, so we had famous people and up-and-comers and students reading from a Kurt Vonnegut graduation speech, because Vonnegut had dozens of them, and we have them bound. So for 4 weeks during quarantine, we hosted a graduation party, and at the end of each one, Lewis would read the names of the graduates, and they would be on Zoom. Like, we had dozens and dozens of families on listening to this 1 hour, graduation celebration. And I really think it was that got him more involved in our work, because Vonnegut has this thing about the most daring thing that a community can do is to solve the terrible disease of loneliness.
To wrap us up here, I'd love to hear if you just have any final quick tips, words of wisdom for people out there who might be starting a nonprofit.
Yes, ask as many questions as you can. Assume you know nothing. Even if you know stuff, assume you know nothing. Advocate for yourself, advocate for everybody else. Everybody you bring into your sphere is someone who can help you in the organization, but you don't want to think of them that way. You want to think of them as their own dignified human being who deserves to be listened to. Yeah, that's it.
All right, what did you think about Julia's tips for starting a nonprofit or starting a nonprofit museum? Is this something you're thinking about doing? I'm curious. Share your thoughts, any lingering questions, all of that good stuff in the comments below. As always, don't forget to check out my website, changemakercafe.com, for more resources. We've got our weekly newsletter up there and information about Changemaker Accelerator, my special program for founders who are looking to grow and start their nonprofits or social impact organizations. All of that said, I can't wait to see you next time. Don't forget to check out the rest of the videos on my channel. I'm Amber Melanie Smith, signing out. Bye.